The teachers are now about to steal the show. And my colleague, Tom Thurston, who's our education director, will briefly introduce this panel. And a special one.
Oh, yeah. I mean, actually, we have a whole line of people who are going to be doing introductions. So I'm just going to kind of break things up a little and say that I'm the work at the GLC as the Director of Education and Public Outreach. Been working there since 2004. And I'm going to be retiring in August. And but we have my replacement, who's going to be filling it, Deja Brabham, who I can tell you is going to do an amazing job. So that's all I have to say. I'm going to turn it over to Ayan.
Yes, welcome, Deja, and good evening, everyone. I'm really grateful for this chance to join Tom and David and all of our colleagues at the GLC in welcoming you to the second part of our symposium, the Teacher Roundtable and on the Pedagogies of Resistance. And we're going to hear from some really brilliant educators tonight. I'm really grateful for their presence with us. They'll share their experiences, their reflections, and they're all the more important now at this very fraught moment in this country's history. We touched on this in the previous panel, but this moment where this attempts, our collective attempts to reckon with the legacies, history of slavery and racism are being met with increasing attacks on intellectual freedoms of teachers and students. And so I'm especially grateful that in that moment, in that environment, you're willing to discuss this with us. So I want to take a moment to just reiterate great gratitude to David, to Michelle, to Daniel and Melissa for working together on this long series of Fortunoff and GLC attempts to think through comparative racial regimes together. In this roundtable, we're really thinking of it as a chance for us to learn from these educators how it is that they're teaching these histories, complex histories of resistance, how it is that they're putting these histories in dialogue with one another in their classrooms. It is also a chance for us to really celebrate their voices and their work and the voices and the work of their students. And hopefully this will be just one step, one of many steps as we build partnerships to work on these difficult histories together. The roundtable will be moderated by my colleague and friend, Leslie Blateau, and she will introduce the panelists. Leslie has been the president of the New Haven Federation of Teachers since the beginning of 2022. Prior to this, she was a teacher in New Haven schools for over 16 years, teaching social studies. And she's a member of the Anti-Racist Teaching and Learning Collective and has been a leader in local efforts to implement anti-racist curricula and to empower student voices in the classroom. She's a Yale alumna. She holds an undergraduate degree in theater and in history and a master's in urban education. I've had the privilege of working with her for almost 2 years now. We work together on the race and citizenship curriculum at the Fortunoff Archive, which focuses on the construct of race and its relationship to citizenship rights in 1930s Germany and in Jim Crow US. So with that, I will just reiterate how wonderful it's been to work together, and I'll turn it over to you, Leslie, to introduce our panelists.
Thank you, Aaron. It's great to be here tonight with everybody. We really enjoyed the first part of the night, and I'm excited to hear from these extraordinary educators now. So I think how we'll start is I'll do a introduction of each person one at a time, intro, and just let them say a little bit more about themselves, their own pedagogical views, what they're working on, whether it be in the classroom with students, whether it be their work with curricula, whether it be their work with training other teachers. Just let them give you a little bit of more of a get to know you than the official bio. And then we'll jump into some questions where we'll just open it up. Okay, so I'd first like to introduce Deja Brabham. She is a public historian, curriculum writer, and teacher educator. She holds a BS in secondary education from Southern Connecticut State University and an MA in public history from the Royal Holloway University of London, where she researched transnational Black resistance movements and Black feminist print culture. In July, she will be joining the Gilder Lehrman Center as the Education and Outreach Manager. That's exciting news. And prior to that, she worked as a high school social studies teacher and teacher educator. In 2019, she was awarded a Fulbright to receive her MA in Public History and was a recipient of the Barzin Prize to expand her play Homegoing and produce stories about Afro-diasporic histories. She is also an adjunct faculty member at Southern Connecticut State University and steering committee member of the Anti-Racist Teaching and Learning Collective. In addition to writing curriculum, she has facilitated several professional development opportunities and served as a panelist for various webinars and conferences to discuss anti-racist, culturally relevant pedagogy. So Daisha, with that introduction, tell us a little bit more about you, who you are, what you teach, and what you're working on these days.
Hi, everyone. In addition to all those kind of other things, I think first and foremost, I'm an educator. And so currently I teach high school. So I teach civics and the Black and Latino studies course in Windsor. And so I'll kind of just talk a little bit about some things my students have been doing. In the last couple of weeks, they've just been finishing up some oral history interviews with modern day activists around their local community, which kind of builds on kind of how the course has been going over the last year. I'm really proud of the work that they've been doing, and I'm excited to talk more about that. And I'm also really excited to speak on this panel with these brilliant educators as well.
Thank you, Daisha. Next, we have Lindsay Rossler. She is a history teacher at King's School in Stamford, Connecticut. Lindsay has been teaching for over 17 years. She holds an MA from Teachers College at Columbia University and a BA in History and Political Science at Emory. Lindsay teaches world history, advises student activities, and creates curriculum with RFK human rights. She approaches teaching through the lens of how we treat one another and focuses on student thinking, empathy, and defending human rights. Prior to teaching at King's School, she taught at Hunter College High School in New York City, where she taught global history, early American history, and college level international relations. Lindsay, tell us a little bit more about what you're working on these days and who you are.
I have been working a lot with Aya Marchik at the Fortunoff Archives in the last few years, although we've been working together for probably close to a decade now. And I'm really excited about thinking about storytelling as an act of resistance. And so my students right now are partnered with JFS in Greenwich, which is resettling people coming in from places like Afghanistan, Ukraine, Haiti. And my students will be engaged also in an oral history project with people through JFS by the end of the year.
Thank you. We're going to come back to learning more about the oral history work. But before that, I am excited to introduce Teresa Willis. She is the founder of Anansi Learning, a professional development company that supports history, civics, government, and humanities teachers in transforming curriculum and instruction through a nationwide peer learning community committed to educational equity. Teresa previously taught in New York City public and private schools and also worked as a curriculum developer with the Morningside Center for Teaching Social Responsibility. She is also a skilled restorative practice trainer who trained K-12 teachers and administrators in how to implement restorative practices. Teresa's debut young adult novel, I am realizing I don't have the second page to this, so you have to wait to hear the title of her young adult novel.
Like a Tree Without Roots.
Beautiful. I got it right here. Her young adult novel, Like a Tree Without Roots, Ache Publishing 2012, dissects the interior world of an African-American teenager whose hatred of her dark skin and kinky hair propels her on a journey of self-love and acceptance. Called, quote, a blueprint for self-discovery by one teen reviewer. I love teen reviewer. That's gay. Like a Tree Without Roots is an emotionally wrenching yet brilliantly triumphant story of affirmation and healing. Teresa earned her undergraduate degree in psychology, her graduate journalism degree from the Columbia University, her master's in social work also from Columbia University, and her master's degree in education from Metropolitan College of New York. Welcome, Teresa, and share with us what you're working on these days.
Thank you. Glad to be here. So who am I? Besides that, I am the daughter of Lofton Anne Marie Willis. I am a sister to 3 brothers, 2 sisters. I'm an avid tennis player, fan, but really not anymore since Serena's gone. I just have to keep it real. And yes, I am currently birthing a professional development company for teachers, specifically history, civics, government, and humanities teachers, so that we can teach history in ways that are engaging, that we can be involved in truth telling, where teachers learn to use primarily primary sources, source documents, coupled with historical analysis skills, aka critical thinking skills, so that students can determine for themselves the truth or validity of things like there was no Holocaust, or things that are said just as recently as, several months to a year ago, slavery was actually good for African Americans, or the election was stolen. Again, keeping it real and current. So that's what that's the huge project that I am currently working on. Just this to create a nationwide peer learning community. In the training program, it's a year-long. Teachers will actually create their own textbooks using primary sources and pedagogical skills and strategies that will hone throughout the training. Foundational, though, before we even start talking about pedagogy, is that teachers spend the first 2.5 months understanding their own positionality, their own social location, and how that impacts what they teach, what they choose to learn, how they teach, but also they have to be cognizant of and understand their students' positionalities and how all of this plays into teaching and learning. So that's what I'm currently up to.
Thank you. So you see me awkwardly moving the mic. I'm encouraging you to do it too, just so people can hear you. I have a loud voice and I'm comfortable with the mic. I'm inviting you to get comfortable too, because you're saying good things. I want folks online to hear you. Okay. And we can take a moment to put it back and pick it up. We got time. So let's start off talking about resistance. I think Professor Magaziner, in his introduction to this work earlier this evening, I'm paraphrasing, said as long as there has been enslavement, genocide, colonialism, there has been resistance. That is central to the work that is going on in your classrooms and the work that you're doing across the country, building curriculum and working with teacher educators. So I want to get into and learn more about how you as educators are centering resistance, whether it be in your classrooms, curriculum, or in the work that you're doing with teachers.
Okay, so I'm gonna get comfortable with the microphone. That's what we say. Okay. So outside of school, I am one of the lead educators for RFK Human Rights, and their education arm is a curriculum called Speak Truth to Power, and it is all around individual human rights defenders as the way into understanding different historical or current issues surrounding human rights. And I think one of the ways that it's important to not just teach teachers how to use the curriculum, which I do, but also bring that same idea into my classroom, is to say that there are people actively doing things to affect change, and that they're individuals and they are not always successful and they fail, but they are all sort of a way in to look, people are actively doing things. So.
Yeah. And I would say similarly, I kind of made the shift a little bit, really being inspired by a really good friend and a really brilliant educator who taught here in New Haven, Natalia Berginski, of how could you, especially going into teaching the Black and Latino course, how could you shift the curriculum to be very inspiring, but also informative at the same time? And that model has really worked throughout the year. I think a lot of times when students learn about race or talk about race in the classroom, because there's such an apprehension from their educators about, so afraid to talk about this, I'm so nervous to talk about this, it can kind of cause a tension that kind of leads to just talking about the sadness, right? Like, let's talk about the oppression, let's talk about the trauma. But kind of centering resistance empowers students, a lot more affirming for them to talk about. And so when I was going to craft the curriculum or to write the curriculum for the Black and Latino Studies course, I wanted to make sure that every single unit touching upon resistance in some shape or form. So if you're going to be learning about the WPA narratives, let's look at the WPA narratives through the eyes of resistance, right? Because there's a lot of different examples, small ways that people were challenging the system. And then you could do the same thing, you know, whether that be in the decolonization, looking at decolonization, right? So for the units there, enslavement, resistance, colonization, decolonization. And then how do you then shape that to kind of look locally at how resistance is playing out here? Which I think a lot of students, because they're so used to hearing the oppression, they don't necessarily hear happy songs. They're not singing those happy songs. And so how do you bring that to the students so that they then feel empowered and activated to then take change in their own local communities?
Can you hear me? Oh, yeah. Okay, so I'll just second what Deja just shared, and Lindsay as well, in thinking about leading and guiding teachers in really creating their own textbook and year-long curriculum material. First and foremost is whose voice is missing. Okay, what's not here? And when you answer that question, you're going to find so much resistance that you never even imagined.
Sorry, I just want to also add in, it's just a lot of times when students think of resistance, they do always cling to those really heroic stories. So they're looking for the Nat Turners, they're looking for the Toussaint Louvertures. They're not necessarily looking for those individual pieces of resistance. And so when you add that to the story, as you're saying, it really does reshape the entire way that they kind of the time period as well, because it becomes a lot more lively, it becomes a lot more engaging, it seems a lot more relatable to them. Because not all of us, unfortunately, not all of us are going to be Nat Turners. We're not going to all be Toussaint Louvertures, right? We're not all going to be Martin Luther Kings, but we can still make change in those intentional ways.
I'm back to, okay. So I think, to sort of piggyback on all of this is the idea of resisting the dominant narrative, right? And so there are works like Abena and the Important Men, and even just smaller stories of resistance. For example, when I'm teaching the Holocaust and we're talking about spiritual resistance, right? The woman who fasted during Yom Kippur, regardless of what the SS and Gestapo, what they were doing to her in the camps, right? Or the girl who starts a school in the ghetto. She's nameless, right? But her story is one of resistance, right? And so giving names and voices to people who are left out, I think, is so much of what I try to do in the classroom and frame as resistance, whether it's to a dominant narrative or to whatever the dominant storyline is that kids get in their textbooks.
And another benefit of asking and answering that question is that historical narrative becomes much more layered. Initially, I was thinking much more complex, but not necessarily. It definitely becomes much more layered. And when you speak about narrative storytelling, I'm a big proponent of that as well, having students start off the year by writing their own narrative, which then becomes a primary source document, and them examining their motives, giving them a prompt, or whether they're the hero of the story or a time where they fell short or let themselves down. They have that to use when they are looking at historical narratives of, oftentimes historical figures, but everyday figures as well. The other piece is that when you look at whose voices are left out, you can see yourself in that. Okay, because no, you might not see yourself as Nat Turner, but you will see yourself as the figure that you just spoke about. But you can take any narrative in history, the civil rights movement. You can see yourself, you can see your mother in the stories of the women who cooked all that food for all those people who came south to do the work that they did, and put themselves in danger of losing their lives. It just opens things up tremendously.
Let's stick with, really like the way you acknowledged, Aisha, that not everyone is going to be a Martin Luther King, a Toussaint Louverture. So I'm going to ask the question, how can we introduce new heroes? You've already answered a little bit. We're having teachers write their own textbooks. We're asking the question, whose voices are missing? We're having students write their own narrative that becomes a primary source. It's beautiful. But let's keep going because you have examples. So how are you introducing new heroes? How are we redefining heroes? And who are some of these heroes that are resonating with the young people in your classroom and with the teachers that you're supporting?
I was kind of find, I think if we're thinking about history as to be about heroes, I think the best ones that we can find are those who spoke for justice, spoke for change. I think what's most interesting to me is, especially as we kind of continue to kind of engage in these history wars of who's being reclaimed, who's being canceled, is that a lot of times we spend so much time trying to kind of reclaim or hold on to these really problematic figures, as opposed to kind of introducing heroes that you want your students to have. But I also think that there's a kind of problem with seeing history as just being a narrative of history of heroes.
Ashe.
Because if you think about it, especially in the classroom, that's the stories that we've all been told, right? In the classroom, you have our heroes who are oftentimes, the ones that we want to claim, right? But oftentimes they're white. Right? They're the abolitionists. They're the William Wilberforces. You have the villains, right? Those are kind of the Bill Connors, like the people who you want to see as, we're not them, right? But then within that, you have the quote unquote victims who are kind of there with no agency. Right. They have the everyday people who kind of existed and dealt with and lived within these systems get lost in that. And so for me, I think if we're going to introduce new heroes, how do we introduce ones that you would want your kids to look up to? But also, how do you also not so much focus so much on people, but also just the systems and the organizing? Right. This came up at the GLC conference in November, which really still sticks with me today, is if teachers stop talking about teaching the how, the what, but the how, or even stop teaching the who, but the how, then I think students can gain a lot more out of that. I just taught my activism unit talking about the 60s and 70s, and my students weren't reading through speeches, right? They weren't reading through speeches. They were reading newsletters, right? They were looking at primary sources of everyday people who were writing into those newsletters, 13-year-olds who wanted to walk out and take charge, right? People who kind of go nameless in our historical record, but really were the drivers of the movement, right? And I think that's a lot more interesting to students, a lot more engaging, especially because a lot of students are tired, and it's so sad because a lot of students are so tired of hearing about the people, right? They're so tired of hearing about Martin Luther King and learning about his letters to Birmingham. They're so tired of it. So how do you kind of engage them with new stories that are a lot more informative for themselves, but also teach about the systems that people were actively trying to fight against and the strategies they were using to challenge the system?
So I guess one thing that I would sort of offer to that is that I think kids do sometimes resonate with the who, right? Like, how do you make 6 million something that you can feel? How do you make all of the people under apartheid, under Jim Crow, Nazi Germany, how do you make that real to high school kids if you don't give them a story, right? And not that it has to be a hero, because I don't want to teach heroes. I want to teach that if it's the human story, we're fallible. So I want to stay away from heroes, but I do want to find that story, whether it's the girl with the school in the ghetto, or it's, whomever it is. I do sort of, I guess, I think the how matters, but I think if the kids don't have a who in their mind, then sometimes they can't build that empathy that I'm desperate for them to strengthen.
To add on, the how matters, the why really matters. And who's to say who's a hero? Again, if we're offering students source material that we have to work with them to really understand how to deconstruct and understand. And that might take 3 months, it might take a whole year, depending upon, who's in front of you. How can I tell them who's a hero if that's the frame from which I'm teaching? And that's how I want to train teachers to practice, what they do in the history classroom. And going back to that narrative that they construct, that original document about themselves, and that's ongoing. It's ongoing, argumentative writing, personal essay writing. So when they look at their own narrative, were they the hero in this story, or were they the villain, or did they exhibit parts of both? So now we're getting into the complexities and the nuances of any history and of any figure and of any human being alive, because we all exist, right, on a continuum. So for me, the binary, it's not going to work, even if that's how I might have learned history. I'm seeing a few head nods. That's just not who we are. That's not who we are as a nation. That's not who we are as any particular group of people. That's not who we are as individuals. So what would be important for students to wrestle with the contradictions. Come on, the contradictions. That's, get eighth graders in that mode, where they really can understand their own contradictions, because they're doing all this personal essay writing. And then by the time they're delving into some primary sources and they're looking at what this person says here, but my God, he did this, and we're not giving that to them. We're not telling them that so-and-so wrote the Declaration of Independence or did this or did that, but was also, an enslaver. They're coming to this on their own, and they're deciding, and I'm not even deciding they're deciding hero or villain, but they're just deciding based on, for me, some key concepts, one of which being power. So I'll say more about that later, but setting the history classroom up that way to where students are challenged and pushed, even if they push back against it, but pushed to think, what were the motives, and what are the power dynamics going on here, and why do you think this person chose to do this, even though they're writing this? So forget hero villain, because it's much more interesting than that. We all are.
Yeah, and sorry, just to that, I'm also just thinking about, oftentimes when people think about resistance, it's complicated, it's messy. Like partnerships, like solidarity building, alliance building, that's really messy, right? Like even if you look within, for my work of looking at Black feminist newsletters in Britain, there was such a debate about sexuality, of like leaving out trans folks, leaving out the LGBTQIA community. Engaging your students with that, right? Like how that's all messy, right? Or even, oftentimes my students last year, we took a look at W. Du Bois's data visualizations and who he was choosing to put to the forefront and who he was choosing to put in the back. And the students were able to comment on that, but that wasn't, I think immediately students kind of go to, oh, now dang, he got to be canceled, right? And it doesn't have to be that. So getting your students out of that is kind of a challenge in itself, of trying to get them from that immediately, I got to cancel, and as opposed to look at the nuances. But it's such a fruitful process, and that once you get your students there, history becomes a lot less ornamental. It becomes a lot less decorative, like, oh, it's nice to know about this fact, and a lot more purposeful, because now this is starting to inform, how do you then deal with the people around you today, right? How do you deal with alliance building today? Which students will make those ties if you draw it for them.
This is good. You are clearly redefining approaches to history education right here for this group tonight. You've all made the case for why it's much more complex than heroes. You made the case for the how, you made the case for the who, you made the case for the why, and all the above. And you made it clear that contradiction is what we're drawn to as human beings. Nuance has to be part of this. Also, Teresa, what you were saying tells us that what you're doing and what you're helping teachers to do is building agency and power among our students because you're giving them those tools. So I want to get a little bit more kind of go towards like strategies in the history classroom. What else are you doing? Because let's be real, our students are out of practice. We lost. I'm not a fan of talking about learning loss, okay? Because we define what the standards. But what I do like to say is that we've lost some of our routines. The pandemic has interrupted a lot of our routines. So we have to rebuild. And you're the women who are doing it. So I want to get into what you're doing to bridge students back into some routine or building new routines to help them with that primary source analysis, secondary source analysis, and ultimately building their agency so that they can go towards the contradictions, not run away from them.
So one thing I'll share is that, and I'm open to pushback on this criticism, but we do too much work. Teachers do too much work. It's like we're doing the work for them, and that teaches them nothing.
Yep.
So no pushback here. I don't know about the online crew or the online crowd, but I mean, if honestly, if teachers just stop and think, if we, just step back and take a look at ourselves, we're doing too much work, and then they become dependent upon that. I mean, even the word work. I'm doing my work. This ain't about work. So I'll just go back to writing and just even starting off the year, having students do, you can call it stream of consciousness writing, free writing for 3 minutes, pencil, pen, doesn't leave the page. Then you put that away. That's theirs. I don't need to see it. It's anonymous. Doing that every day. And then, depending upon your students, week 2, week 3, slipping in some prompts that are connected to the curriculum so that now they're used to that. Serves 2 purposes. 1, they're writing, but 2, it's they're getting into their interior selves and their interior lives, and mining that throughout the course of the year to do, as I talked about earlier, they're looking at their own motives so that when they're reading a primary source, they're not just reading it because the teacher said they had to read it and, they have to do this because this is the way this teacher teaches in that class, but they're reading it because they really understand a lot more about the human psyche, and they're looking for motive. They're looking for the why. They might not be looking for the contradiction, but they're going to see it. And so I don't mean to sound like a broken record, but again, I just think opportunities that along the way, as particular as history teachers, we've missed by just handing them, even just, and we know we can't do this, but even just handing them the primary document without having done this work beforehand. This work has to come, and students also understanding their own positionality, not going in depth the way I would with adults, but just having them, just be aware and write down. So who am I as, as a woman, as a lesbian 13-year-old? Who am I as, whoever, someone who plays tennis, someone who likes school, someone who doesn't like school? All of that is useful for them, and it's useful for later on in the semester.
So I wrote a bunch of things down. Okay, so to directly answer your question, Aya and I were considering that a lot when we decided to make this methods curriculum around testimonials, right? Was if kids are struggling more now with literacy, if their interpersonal skills have taken a hit from the pandemic, what's the way into history and to help rebuild those skills? And so that was a big part of our sort of thinking and motivation to work on this curriculum that I'm piloting now at King. I think additionally, to your point, giving kids some responsibility and ownership in the direction of their learning helps sort of motivate them to go further with it. So I have kids do a paper where they pick a conflict in the world and then they become my newscasters in the first part of the year. and become sort of experts. And then we start talking about, now that you know something, what are the questions that you have? How would you, as a historian, then find out how your conflict got to be where it is? And then that's the basis of what they do in the second semester. So it's theirs.
Yes.
And I think that's a really important piece. Additionally, this idea of thinking routines, I think helps students. So helping kids know that when they come in the room, you know, if you're starting a topic, what do I know? How do I know it? What are my questions? How do I find those answers, right? Just getting kids in the habit of, if I see this document, what are my questions? If I see sort of this kind of source, how should I be thinking? And doing that with students a lot so that it becomes routine, because it's not just if they have the ability, the cognitive ability, it's also, do they know what to do when something's in front of them now? Okay.
Yeah, I agree. I think I really want to just I really love what both of you are saying of just, it's trusting students. It's trusting students in the same way that we want to trust teachers. Trusting that they can kind of rise to the occasion and really I think that I'll just kind of speak on how do you localize that and kind of personalize that to then make them feel like they can kind of bring about change. And I feel like, again, the activism unit, I'm just going to go back to it of just thinking about, I was so proud because after a whole year of shaping kind of the routine of my class was, we're going to start off with you personally, then we're going to go to the historical content, and then the base, your application of it, your assessment will then be something that's based in the modern day. And so having the students kind of start off thinking about what are some of the issues that you would want to see change today, then looking at the 60s and 70s. And I was super proud. So they analyzed the 10 points, the 13 points of the Young Lords, the Black Panthers. And they went and did in the Combahee River Collective, and they looked at all the different ways and the different things that people were fighting for. And then being able to ask them, okay, well, where do you see areas where these groups could have come together? Where might they have separated? Where might they have come together? But then it was even more powerful to see students then, for the National Day of Action, have a student-led teach-in for their teachers, where students from that class generated a list of different ideas of what if you could report back to teachers what you would want to see change in the classroom, what would you say? And I didn't even have this, mind you, this was like the day before break. Okay, this is like right before we're about to leave for spring break. And these students went and generated an entire list of just such thoughtful and intentional ideas. But then seeing those students then go with other groups in the school. So they went to the Action Club. They went to our Black Excellence Club. They went to our Gender and Sexual Alliance class. How would you inform this document? And watch them work across quote unquote group lines of, hey, what do you want to see represented in this conversation? And then to see that even applied through the oral history interviews, where a student was interviewing activist Warren Leach from Waterbury, Connecticut, who runs classes. And again, I did not talk to her about this at all. She had researched in her evidence log, she had researched what are the different organizations in Waterbury, and then went to ask him during her history interview, how do you organize across group lines, right? But that was just letting her localize that, internalize that, and then it just became, like you said, a routine, like second nature for her to just go and ask those questions. And so I really appreciate that piece is so important, and not just having it's so exhausting to do the other way. Have students just memorize dates, and that's so exhausting when you just give them the chance. And then you just become a lot more of a facilitator.
Yeah.
I think then giving them the opportunity to take what they know and move it, right? Because I'm fortunate. I mean, I teach these wonderful kids. I teach the honors and AP, and I mean, all kids are fantastic, but like I teach these kids that sometimes think that the point of what they know is to know it and do it on a test. And I'm like, I don't care what you know if you don't do something with it, right? And so what do you do with it, right? You take it to the human rights cohort, you go to the affinity groups, you make curriculum with me that we then publish on RFK, because there's not an AAPI human rights defender. And now there's a lesson about Fred Korematsu because one of my students was like, it's missing. Wow. And I said, great, let's do it. Now it's there, right? So take what you know and use your power, right? Show that you have power and that what you learn actually can take you somewhere, or you can you can move people.
Yeah. And that is important because not all these students are going to be Fred Hampton. You know, they're not all going to be local activists and community organizers. But what it does kind of let them know is that no matter in whatever capacity, I can find what I love to help people. And that kind of causes agents for, that's what creates agents for change as opposed to just, you know, history just being there.
So let me just add, what they are going to be is they're the future.
Yeah.
They're going to be our Senate. They're going to be senators, representatives. So for me, it's as foundational as that. I'm not trying to tell you that, you know, you've got to take this and go out and, you know, start a petition or do this or do that. You know, that I think it's great that you're doing that. But for me, history education has to be liberatory because these kids are going to be the ones to grow up to run for office, right? To head corporations. They're going to be the ones that have the power. So I need them to have really, really wrestled with how it's been done before and how did that work out? That's where I am in this.
This is reminding me of what Professor Vincent was teaching us about, that during apartheid, education for South Africans was for subordination. You told us, and it was a pessimistic project. And this is education for liberation, and this is not being optimistic and in a way that we're naive, but never forgetting that we're moving in a direction of shifting power to young people so that they can chart their own course. And you gave us such concrete examples of ways that you're giving up power and giving your students power so that they can develop that agency, what to be whomever they decide to be.
So it's shared power to learn and understand and to understand it together. Yeah.
It's beautifully put. I'm going to shift us from organizing, even though I like thinking about organizing as a labor leader. I do remember a quote. I remember when I was learning how to teach, my professor was watching me run around the room like a jerk. And he said to me, "Come here. One of the first things I learned in organizing is that you don't do for people what they can do for themselves." And I never forgot that. And I stopped running around giving my students their pencil and picking up the paper when it dropped. And can you do that for me? No, do it for yourself. And it's that's just that fundamental thing, which you're magnifying in very intellectual levels as well. But let's shift from organizing, because our academic and professors, teachers earlier today, both Professor Vincent and Professor Perry referenced the arts. We listened to references to musicians in your lecture and to playwright and theater in Professor Perry's lecture. So I want to hear how the arts are showing up in your classrooms and in your curriculum work, and how that connects to pedagogies of resistance. Good.
So art comes up a lot in my class, just because I think that for me, at least, especially teaching African-American history, but I think African-American history, Latino history, for me, it's not just something you read in a document. Like I always say, Black history really has to be experienced. Like you have to, it's so multisensory in that way. But the arts come up a lot in my class. And I think it plays a huge role in kind of disrupting dominant narratives. I'm just thinking about at the beginning of the year, my students came to the Yale New Haven Art Gallery and they looked at African and Indigenous artifacts. But then we're able to kind of take that and see, okay, well, learning about what comprise those materials and those arts, but then having them for their final project to do a cultural analysis of just the art that's happening now, right? And how that disrupts the idea of kind of, the genocidal narrative of Indigenous people, that they're all extinct, right? As opposed to, no, like they're kind of creating art, they're here, they have issues that they're fighting for, that are still present in the modern day, which was really interesting watching students. Like I have one student who did she did a cultural analysis of Beyonce's Move Forever. I had another student who looked at a video game where she that dealt with Mayan references, and being able to look at that and seeing how those ideas were being repurposed in the modern day. And then for them to do the same thing with Black Panther, right? Which is so much about art and visual, but so political in terms of what it's trying to say and whether or not the message is actually good. And so I think the arts are a really important way of engaging students as well.
I just want to jump in because somebody in the chat, in the question chat just highlighted an example of this, of graffitis to murals as resistance, specifically in Latinx neighborhoods, and just evidence where kind of taggers start, well, graffiti artists start as taggers and eventually move on to muralism. And it's, I just wanted to reference that because it kind of connects to how art can be part of that counter narrative. But I want you to keep going, please.
So, and I think earlier, Professor Vinson, you mentioned music, you mentioned Sun City in particular. I know Tom, our outgoing director, because I was a part of the shared history curriculum where we partnered with teachers in South Africa. So we taught my partner teacher and then a co-teacher in the Bronx. We spent 5 just wonderful days teaching the Soweto uprising, and clearly as part of the shared history, we looked at the music of South Africa, which is just, it just takes you somewhere, but how that was used in just throughout the country in the struggle, not just with the students, but with the adults as well. And of course, here, the Black freedom struggle with the civil rights movement, the freedom singers who also went for college students started off, Bernice Reagan, Cordell Johnson. They later married 2 others whose names escape me now, but they went around the country singing to raise money for the movement. So when we talk about resistance and you're talking about the Black freedom struggle, the struggle for freedom in South Africa, it doesn't happen without music and without dance in South Africa. I mean, when the kids were locked up for days on end, they sang and they kept adding lyrics. I forget which spiritual they had repurposed, but they kept singing, and their punishments were, okay, if you sing, then we're going to take away your toothbrush, we're going to take away your mattress. They just incorporated that into the song. Okay. Again, the song is escaping me now, but those 2 resistance movements don't happen without music. And it makes perfect sense to me that there's no way that, yeah, absolutely, you're going to have music because that song is going to keep you going.
So I don't know if we're talking about literature too here, but I really do enjoy, everything from looking at excerpts of like Charles Dickens and using just literature as a social commentary, Nadine Gordimer, if we're talking about South Africa, Jamaica Kincaid, like taking sections and just looking at how literature is reflecting or pushing society. In terms of movies, sometimes with imperialism, I think using something like Rabbit Proof Fence to look at Australia's colonial past and the legacy there, and having kids sort of watch a movie and think about, well, what do I think the movie's telling me versus what is the history like actually, and having them be really critical of media broadly, but sometimes movies specifically.
And I was just gonna say, I think art can also be particularly useful when you're talking about trauma. I made the conscious decision after watching the George Floyd video that I was no longer going to show images in the classroom. I just don't really see them as being useful anymore. And so how do you discuss things like lynching or kind of like the death of Emmett Till or the murder of Emmett Till in the classroom? And so for me, music was my way of being able to have those conversations. So I'm not going to show you the image of Emmett Till. But what I can do is have you listen to Mississippi Goddamn by Nina Simone, or I can have you listen to Bob Dylan, like kind of tell that story. And so that can be really useful because that was actually one thing that the students did put down on that student generated list, is that they were kind of sick of seeing images just kind of be thrown on them, like just seeing just trauma because they're so used to it now. And I think that's the other important thing is that students they're living through a lot right now, so that is important that they also have that hopeful message there. Just because they already have so much trauma, on their timeline beats, right? Being in the classroom when the video of Tyree Nichols came out, right, was another kind of thing that teachers have to navigate. So how do you find sources that can speak to that without traumatizing?
I just want to thank you for highlighting that.
So you have made it clear through that most recent answer how much stress and trauma our students are experiencing. And we know that educators also experience vicarious trauma by being in space and community with our students we know who are carrying so much. So one of the questions from Zoom describes, we know how much pressure and how much stress teachers are under. So this person wants to know, what are some of the forms of support you wish we could have from community members and from the public?
Being in community. I want to be in community with y'all. Like I want to be together. I want to work together as a group to kind of solve the issues. And I think that's the key, is that so much of the models within our education systems are anti-community, right? We have individual learning plans, right? Our student learning objectives are, I will be able to, not we will conquer this together. And that also gets repurposed when you're thinking about professional developments for teachers, right? So teachers are going to come and listen and hear. And so I think being in community, that word community, is important. And that's historically what has gotten us through times of trauma and times of oppression. And that's what's going to continue to get us through. And so using that as a framework for how we approach education is, I think, the way to move forward, especially for teachers. Because I think I've always said this, I don't think resources is really the problem, right? I think it's that intentionality, it's the framing. And so working together with teachers to do that is the best way moving forward.
I do think it's a cultural shift since the pandemic to try and prioritize community more. At least I think in our school community, there's been a real shift to try and create community programming and community time. And, our dean of students has started to ask students, I see you're doing X, Y, and Z, but how are you in community? And it's still, I think, sounds foreign to a lot of people, but I think you just incrementally, I agree. I think incrementally, we just have to be moving in that direction, right? But it does, I think there is a shift that has to happen in education for that to happen.
I said we were going to get back to oral history, and I want us to get back to oral history because I think it's important. And then we'll hear from some questions from the in-person audience. Stephen Nairn, who is an incredible human, who I was lucky enough to meet working with Aya on the curriculum. He started us off at the very beginning saying that the goal from the start of the Fortunoff archive is to listen. So given that that really is humanity's goal here, I would love to hear how you're incorporating oral history and how that connects to this crucial skill that we know we all are struggling to maintain and hone, this skill of listening to each other.
Yeah, starting by having kids, students interview family members. Also having a day, a planned, structured day where pick a spot in your community where kids go out and literally interview someone who they see, who they think might have an interesting story. So, and the reason you pose it that way is because all kinds of surprises come when they end up interviewing that student. And then you come back to the class and, the questions are, so why did you think that person would have an interesting story, and what surprised you about that? Those are just two starters there that again just continue the narrative of having kids in the practice of learning what a historical narrative is, but also with going out into the community, gaining confidence, gaining self-confidence. And those are also research projects.
So I think that for my 10th graders, the way that we started was actually a question that I had posed in a session we had gone to a few months ago. Time is, I don't know what. And we started by asking, what kinds of information do you get from testimonials, right? How does that help you learn history? What are the limitations of it? And then ultimately trying to figure out with students, well, now if I agree that it's valuable for these reasons, to build empathy, to have a primary source, right? The things that my students said, great, well, how do you listen to people then, right? How do you, if you have someone in front of you, what do you do? And it was really interesting to hear them say, well, you look them in the eye and you let them speak and you don't interrupt and you don't think about what you're going to say. And I said, oh, so you don't raise your hand when someone's talking and then but we made like this whole list, right, of these are the ways that you center the person that you're talking to, which is very much in line then with the Fortunoff method, right, of centering the witness. And so I think really giving students that way to connect, like, this is what historians do, and then this is how you hone your listening skills to hopefully do that thing.
Yeah. And I would just say, I think it also just speaks to a lot of our students are really looking for that. They're looking for that mentorship. I will be honest, kind of happy, especially given that I'm going to be leaving. But I'm really happy that I have the experience to do the oral history project before I left. I might get emotional talking about it, but just seeing kind of how the students were able to engage with the oral histories was just so powerful. And just learning how to be an active listener, which I think a lot of them actually want to do. I had one student who interviewed his coach, who turns out used to be a bodyguard for Cesar Chavez, who's now the head of security at our school. And I had no clue. I was just sitting next to him one day and I'm like, yeah, he's like, by the way, I met Cesar Chavez and I used to be his bodyguard. I'm like, what? But this was his coach. And so watching them sit down together with tea and crackers, but watching him just ask his coach and be able to learn all these cool stories of not just the activism piece, but just the small parts, like of him saying like, oh, like he's a white man, and him saying like, I brought a Black girl to my prom and what that meant for him in that time period. And growing up in the 60s, I had another student who talked to our substitute teacher, who actually was a circulations manager for a Black newspaper in Detroit, and having him talk, that when I asked the student, I said, who do you want to interview? He said, I want to hear from someone older. I want to hear from someone who's experienced, who's wise. And I'm like, that's so opposite of what most people would think you would hear a kid say. But that's what he wanted to hear from. And him saying like, what was the difference between now and today? And, what did it feel like being a Black man growing up in these areas, and hearing him talk about he found it really interesting. He learned in the interview came up that he had attended the Million Man's March, and that this small group of Black men made that commitment to each other that day, that they would never lay a hand on another Black man. They said, if I can't help you, I won't hurt you. And that stuck with him, and he still kept talking about it. He just they were so excited just to hear these like small perspectives, and then hearing it from the modern day too. So I think oral histories are a real gateway in terms of giving students the opportunity to conversate, but also to have, again, when we're thinking about new heroes to look up to and to deepen those connections. Connection is something that I think a lot of students are looking for.
And someone on the Zoom also, and I think you answered the question even without me asking, but I want to acknowledge this person and then open it up to here. Like how we get students to like think outside themselves, and clearly the oral history and the specific ways you do it are accomplishing that. But keep that in the back of your head as we're fielding these questions too. But let's open it up. Okay, go ahead. I'm just so yeah. What wonderful people you all are. Your students, they will
one thing I'd like to ask, so you must have, of course, students who are whose parents are Trump supporters, or whose parents belong to a very kind of narrow religious sect. So do you get students coming and say, well, my father said blah, blah, blah. And do you also sometimes get the reverse where the student comes back and said, well, now my mother has changed her opinion from something I brought in school.
So I've found in 17 years of teaching in two pretty different communities, that as long as you focus on teaching kids how to think, and not what to think, I really haven't had parents or pushback from kids or families, but I've also taught in New York and Connecticut. And I don't know, I have colleagues at RFK who teach in Tennessee who aren't allowed to teach what I'm allowed to teach and have kids thinking about.
I can just, sorry, I was just saying, and I think this is, I actually this year was my first time. I did face some pushback from a student transferred out of my class, which I didn't know about. But I think that is, I think protecting and affirming teachers of color's rights to be in the education system is important. And I'll just say that, I think that is a really important piece, just because I do think that when we think about the attacks, oftentimes it can be teachers of color who face a lot more disproportional reactions to that, especially if you look across the country. I think that was spoken at the GLC at the conference in November, of just how different the impact of that can be in terms of facing pushback.
Cosign, this is brilliant, generative, and so exciting to hear, energizing after a long day. A question sort of to what Leslie was asking about routines in the context of out of school time and out of school places. I work in a library that is both a special collections repository and museum. And so just thoughts you have on engaging kids in cultural heritage institutions outside of school, whether it's libraries, museums, outdoor spaces, thoughts you have on that for now and for the future.
So at my school, I created put together an enrichment sort of opportunities database, and have been actively trying to find students to go to our local historical societies and museums. And I had a student this year who partnered with Aya at Fortunoff to do some research, and I'm hoping to have other students in the future do the same. I think it's profoundly important to get kids into those spaces and digging into things and learning history and doing it that way.
If they become engaged, I think if they are given the freedom to discover and uncover history and wrestle with it and grapple with it, then it's my thought that they will want to visit places like that. Not that I'm telling them they have to go, or any teacher, but if the resource is put to them and if they understand that, because, in a new framework, kids are generating their own questions. They're not doing this, day 1, day 2, even day 102, but they are learning how to come up with their own essential question, even their own research questions. So they will know very quickly, well, we ain't got any of that in this library here, 2 doors down. So where might you find that? And that's, again, big proponent of just really setting them up to just want to be historians. Never telling them that that's what we're doing, but really just giving them everything. And because we all come here really wanting to learn, we all come here curious. I mean, we've just been missing the boat. That's just real talk.
Yeah. And experiences are really important, especially in the aftermath of the pandemic. My students came to Yale, like I said, Yale New Haven, and they loved it. They had so much fun watching them debate over paintings. But to say that, schools need the resources to be able to have students engage in those things. So we have to have a budget to bring those students on those field trips.
I think students are spread so thin with competing distractions, that structuring and incentivizing youth to be interns in these spaces and giving them stipends to do it is important as well, because there's a lot going on, and a small stipend will honor their efforts, and then they're the ambassadors to get their peers in as well. So again, labor leader, paying people for their work, but also, and that's just acknowledging also that like teens there's a lot pulling them, and they need sometimes some carrots. I'm not trying to undervalue their intrinsic motivation, but I think it's important to acknowledge. Yeah, jobs are good.
Hi, first, I want to acknowledge and echo what was stated. You all seem to be phenomenal teachers. And I want to know if you're only teaching AP classes and honors students, because it is my thought that students from an early age know when they're being bullshitted. So when students see that the teachers don't care about them, they don't care about being there. So if they get the caliber of teachers you all are, I don't care whether they've been classified as learning disabled or whatever, you just see a spark, the curiosity grows. And I'm just wondering who you all teach. Then I have one other comment, and that has to do with the community, the oral history, which I had when I heard you all say oral history, I was hoping. You said being in community with regards to being teachers and your students, but widening that scope and oral interviews outside, I think is great. If you could connect them to, you said this young man said, to those, we tend to separate our elders, bringing them into a space where people would love to tell you about their history, where no one listens to them anymore, and connecting our youth to our elderly. That would be a phenomenal thing to do.
I can just say that when I taught, no, I wasn't teaching AP and honors classes. And to your last point, that was a vision of mine years ago, actually in Harlem. And I had actually already contacted some elder care centers, and it was going to be part of the curriculum. I think it was once a month, like at the same day out of the month, we would go and be with those elders, and the main focus obviously was to have conversations, but then it could be, you know, whatever, however that interaction played out. So yes, I'm no longer in that space, but yes to the idea.
So I currently teach AP and honors classes. I have taught not AP and honors classes. I do teach very diverse learners. And I'm actually very interested in the idea of twice exceptionality and students who are sort of off the charts in certain spaces and also really struggle in other spaces, and trying to help navigate for them in a school system or an education system that oftentimes doesn't understand how they learn. Trying to really help them navigate that and be as strong as they can be and navigate whatever is holding them back.
I currently, all of my classes are unleveled, and I think liberatory, I don't necessarily believe in leveling of classes. I don't really see a difference, and I think the liberatory education should be for everyone. And in terms of I do agree with you. I think that elder piece of just sitting down, when I started the oral histories, I was telling my students about the oral history that I did when I was a grad student, where I got to interview the late, great George Edwards, the Black Panther here in New Haven. Rest in peace to him. And just the chance of being able to be with him in my Honda and him yell at me about not knowing the street signs whenever I lived here for my whole life. But that was so informative just to have somebody who I could look up to and who was from my space. And a lot of students are looking for that connection. I will say my school, shout out to Windsor, they do have a program called Dub Dads, which has been really cool, of just having local dads come into the school and just sit in classes and sit around and be there and community with students. And I think that that model is really important for schools, of bringing the community in to the schools.
Well, the high school I taught in for 7 years didn't have leveling either. It was known as tracking, but we didn't do it, as far as I know. Are you tired of us telling you what terrific teachers you are? I can avoid that. I mean, I've met a lot of teachers over the years, and sometimes they'll say, yeah, all right, applaud for us, but give us a pay raise. Leslie, thank you for dialing up these women. That's about all you had to do, is dial them up. Here's a question. There are currently 2 bills before, it's my way of getting in a side door on something here. There are 2 bills before Congress. Oh, who knows if either one of them has a chance. There's one in the Senate, which has bipartisan support. The one in the House is sponsored by Rosa DeLauro. That's our Congresswoman here. She can get applause without even being here. Amazing. Rosa. Anyway, they're both bills, as I understand them, I haven't quite finished reading them, are all about getting more federal support into public schools. And I think both bills, Leslie, you may know this better than I think they've put civics in the title of the bills for certain, well, probably substantive reasons and political reasons. But what are your thoughts on civics these days? How is it taught? What is it today? I can still remember my 9th grade civics teacher. I'll date myself, but I was in his classroom the day President Kennedy was shot. Maybe that's why I remember the class. But civics was an actual course for years and years and years. What about the Constitution? What about civics? Do you do that? Are you conscious of it? Is there a real course? What's happened to civics?
I'll say, as a civics teacher who just saw my kids yesterday, it is a course, and it's a really important course. And I think part of the hope moving forward, and I'm kind of excited about the new standards that we have that were just rewritten in Connecticut that help to kind of reshape the civics course, is putting a lot more of the civic participation in there. Of getting students to really, again, localize what they're learning. So much of them, well, so much, a lot of times there can be an overdominance on the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists, and then moving in, and then you're just kind of regurgitating. And, so how do you get students to be a lot more engaged in their local communities? Like, I can say that for their final, again, in my district, we have seniors. So I'm teaching seniors in May. So I haven't had kids since February, to be honest, in terms of how they've been engaging with classes. But I will say that this last project has been really helpful for them, where they have to write their own Board of Education public comment. And so having them write a 2-page reflection and be able to report back out their experiences and be intentional about what do you want to, and one thing that, whether that be to the oral histories, is having students leave something behind, that legacy of, hey, you are leaving, you're out of here in the next 2 weeks, but what are you going to leave behind that's going to live beyond you? And so what would you want to share with the educate? And I think that model can be helpful for civics classes, because that's, unfortunately, it's kind of opposite of what a lot of students get. They just kind of get another governmental class, which is helpful, but not necessarily them.
So I have largely been in the world history space where I'm not teaching civics, but when I did, I'd have them find an issue locally, and then they had to figure out who to write to and see if they could affect change on something, right? There was a kid who years ago was just beside himself about what was happening to Astoria Park and wrote to pretty much everyone he could. And Astoria Park, he like led a cleanup, right, with his like local city councilman. But so that kind of thing. But actually, my colleague John, who is sitting next to you, is bringing a civics course to our school next year. There has not been one for forever. So we're making moves.
Yes.
Yeah, just to add on, I mean, civics is paramount, and participatory civics, not learning it from a textbook, but taking an actual action in that class for me would be paramount. And David, there is a state, and because I'm not clear, I won't call it, but there is a state that has just proposed legislation, and it may have even passed, that in civics courses, kids can no longer write letters to their local government. So I don't think, though, that's what you're talking. I turned my phone off, or else I could have called it up very quickly. But yes, it might be, but I'm thinking it is another one of the southern states, but literally just either proposed or passed legislation that said that you could no longer do those kinds of projects in the civics classes in that state. I'm the only one who read this? Really? Somebody look it up. Yeah.
Go to the Google.
Yeah.
Thanks. Thank you very much for your words. They're very inspirational. I've been teaching for about 30 years, a bunch of different schools, both urban and suburban, and now an independent day school. I have spent a lot of time thinking about the balance between wanting history classes to be places where students see themselves, and at the same time wanting history classes to be places where kids see themselves as members of a community, members of a nation, members as citizens in a larger society. I'm sort of interested in how you try to sort of square, because I heard many of you speak very eloquently about sort of having kids see themselves in history, having them understand themselves through historical narrative and through individuals. But there's also, I think, this other question around sort of how we're trying to build a sense of community that goes beyond just simply identity formation, if you know what I mean. Yes, thoughts about that?
I would say it's like it's not only just talking about, I think, the identity. I think it's also how do you teach. This is even what I was just thinking with the civics, is how do you teach imagination? Imagination, creativity. How do you teach hopefulness and dream making? Right? Like a lot of what we've been talking about is also students kind of being able to think about what do they want the future to be. You know, oftentimes in civics classes, students learn about what the government is, not what the government could be. Right. So like, you know, when you look at the kind of ideas about democracy, it's all about what is democracy? Who defined it? James said this before, but kind of like for my students, they learn a little bit about Angela Davis's abolition democracy, and kind of like thinking, okay, well, what could we change or what could we shift? And I think that's important to not just be focused on you. Because when you have to imagine a new world, you have to imagine the rest of us with that.
I think also you can't, I mean, there's two very important parts of it. How can I imagine myself impacting, being part of a larger community if I don't see myself there? Right. So I think there's a piece of it that is you see yourself in it so that you can participate. If you're nowhere in the story, how am I building community with you? How am I part of the nation or the global citizenry if I'm not there?
So in my discourse, I wasn't speaking about identity formation as an end. I was more so speaking about understanding that the motives and aspirations of, you know, any historical figure you can name or pick from the past are no different than some of mine in my 13 or 17 years on the planet. So that's how I'm, using the construction of personal narratives. And what was, say again, the piece about the community for me, please?
Well, one of the challenges that secondary history teachers face right now, and I think it came out of this big debate at the College Board having to do with the African American and the pushback against it was this idea of, well, now we're going to sort of start siloing our narratives, right? And this is an old debate that's existed for years. I mean, universities fought it 25, 30, 40 years ago. We're still fighting it, right? So it's not a new debate. But at the core of that debate, I think is an interesting question, particularly in a pluralistic democracy, around how do we balance the ideas of wanting to forward some very important, highly significant, oftentimes neglected narratives, right? That are oftentimes tied to resistance and struggle. And at the same time, create space for something that is more pluralistic, more inclusive, somewhat has less of a sort of, this is the month we study this group, this is the month we study this group. You see what I'm saying?
Not really. No, I had you up until, and the contrast is that we don't want to have study this group or this group or this group.
I think it's the balance maybe between how do you do both, right? How do you, and I think you just do, right? I mean, I'm going to repeat myself, but I think you can't have the society that I think we would all like to keep working towards, the better union, unless everyone in the union sees themselves as part of it and a valued part of it and an important part of it, and everyone has a voice. Then right? And part of the way that you get your voice is by, I don't know that it's like siloing, but that you do study, every group in society that you can, all the resistors, all the minority, all of the everyone.
So if we're looking to answer some essential questions and even some unit questions, so if we're looking at power, then we're looking at power. So we're looking at, who has power, what they did to get it, who doesn't have power. We're answering that question, an essential question. In a democracy, who has power? So we're looking at a lot, right? If our students are going to spend the year, that's one of their essential questions. In a democracy, who has power? Then we've got a wide range, right? And why wouldn't we want that wide range? What does freedom cost?
I think I guess I would say, I think that's why when I was talking about kind of the heroes, although I think the starting off with students and them talking about their experience is important, it can't end there. And I do think that, and I'm still evolving on this. Actually, I was speaking about this with my mentor a lot. The students being able to see themselves is important to kind of start off, but I do think that can't be the only purpose of history education. Like, you can't spend the entire year focusing on yourself.
Yeah.
And I think that's the hard part, especially that can be the difficult part, because what you don't want to do, and I think that's what you're speaking to, is you just don't want to just keep adding on. And I think that's kind of like that some of what we're kind of being challenged with in Connecticut right now with this new legislation of the Black and Latino Studies course, the Asian American, the Indigenous Studies, where you don't want it to just feel like, okay, now we're just inclusive, like we're just adding that, like there has to have some type of meaning in it. And again, the purpose of history education, like there's a personal piece. Like for me, like I love learning about Black history as a Black woman, but I can't only learn about Black history. Like I have to and the world, like the historical record as it is. And so that's why for me, at least in my classroom, I've tried to not so much focus so much on people, but more systems and periods and investing, divesting, because then it makes a lot more sense. Although the identity piece is important, obviously, but I just don't know if it should stop there.
We're seeing what's there. We're seeing what's there.
Yes, I had to look time to interrupt because it's 8 o'clock and I think it's a good place to pause. I'm just gonna quickly say, we need more forums like this where we have scholars and community, and hopefully at a time where youth can come to, where we can continue to be in community with each other, because there's extraordinary opportunities here. So thanks for the opportunity to bring us together and to reconnect with old friends and make new friends. And Professor Blight is going to close us out.
Apparently Daniel's moving the camera back on me for whoever's left out there. And, oh, okay.
There are 17 left.
They're really, well, good.
Sorry, maybe I should have called that out.
Oh, move over here. Okay, okay, all right.
They're the
Thank you, Dan.
diamonds.
Techno. Well, thank you so much, Leslie, and all three of you. Let this be the beginning of, I mean, we've had a long tradition at the GLC that Tom Thurston has been deeply responsible for however many years it is, Tom, of engaging teachers here in Connecticut, all over New England, in Africa, in at least 3 countries, in Britain. But let this be the beginning, just a suggestion, Daisha, of a regular forum where we bring in new groups of teachers every time. And a new moderator. I mean, you can be the full-time moderator if you'd like, Leslie. Let this be the beginning of regular forums that we do about how we teach the subjects of slavery, abolition, race, etc., or anything else. Let this be the beginning of a new, that's how traditions begin. You got to do it once, then you do it twice, and you got a tradition. Gosh, thanks to all of you. You've almost made me, I always have this fantasy that I should retire here and then see if somebody would just hire me for a year to go teach high school again. And then yeah, but then I think twice about it. Been there. So maybe not. It's yeah. But let this be the beginning of a new kind of forum. Let's just keep doing this. And thank you all for coming, and have a nice Thursday evening. Thanks.